I'm back for chapter 16. This is big business, labor, and of course, a lot of that had to do with making money. Before 1861 in America, we had some factories in the country, but most employed about 25 people or less. They weren't big factories in many cases. And most people worked in farming. We moved from a farming to an industrial economy over time, but farming was still a pretty big deal by this time. You had, during the later half of the 19th century, people like Carnegie, who made his money in steel, and Rockefeller, who made his money in oil, rise to the top. They were often called the robber barons by the media. And Carnegie, an interesting case. He was a rags to riches story. He came from Scotland. He was a poor kid growing up, came here at age 12, and by the time he was in his 30s, he was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And he felt that even though you make money, you should give away money to society to make it a better place. He was a philanthropist, no question about it. He felt that if you come into the world, you should leave the world with nothing. In other words, a rich man dies disgraced. A man who dies rich dies disgraced. He felt that, and he believed that, and he pretty much lived that, although he did leave behind a 64-room mansion in New York City and a castle back in Scotland for his wife and his child. But he gave away a lot of his money, $350 million back in those times, which was, of course, we're talking in the billions today. They made their money in many cases through two different business plans. Vertical integration was where you control all phases of the operation. Let's say in Carnegie's case, not only did he make the steel at his plants, but he owned the railroads or controlled the railroads that got the ore to make the steel, and then got it to the plants and moved it around. Horizontal integration is a bit different, where you buy up your competitors. Rockefeller did this. He bought out competitors to where he owned 90% of the oil business by the time he was in his 30s. And of course, you form monopolies, which he was often in court trying to defend himself, and as the government tried to break up monopolies. Factory conditions weren't very good for people. You looked at, especially the pay was terrible. We didn't have sick days. We didn't have health insurance. We didn't have vacation time. The conditions were so bad that people would often die at work or get maimed and then get fired because they couldn't continue on. Women got less than half the pay usually of what a man got, and children, same thing. Many kids worked in factories, and many kids didn't go to school because the family needed them to work, and many of these workers were immigrants that came from Europe in many cases. So you had some bad conditions in factories, and this often led to unions being developed. The AFL was one of the early ones. Samuel Gompers was the president of the AFL, and he pushed for an 8-hour workday, which is essentially what many people are on today, working 8 hours a day. But quite often, the way to fight back would be striking. The book talks about the Haymarket riot in Chicago, where 7 policemen were killed. I mean, things did get pretty testy at times between the police and the unions, or the unions and the ownership. We had also, during this time, we had companies like George Eastman, who eventually merged with Kodak to make the Kodak camera, Eastman Kodak camera. And of course, back in the 1800s, early 1900s, many people that could afford it bought a small camera to take pictures. Many inventions were coming out during this time. You know, we had Bell, and with the telephone, we had Edison. There was a survey taken a while back, and they talked about the top 10 inventions of the last 1,000 years. And the number one invention in the last 1,000 years was in 1486. The printing press was number one. And also in the top five was the automobile, telephone, electricity or electric lights, and the radio and television. So just think what our life would be without those things today. Department stores were starting to come out. Many farmers who lived in rural areas, of course, would not get into the cities, so they would often order their things, items through catalogs. Montgomery Ward, Sears were a couple big examples of the department store and mail order. Quite often they had a money-back guarantee, which was pretty interesting. If you didn't like your item that you ordered, you could send it back and get your money back. That was a novel idea when all this began. And free delivery, which often meant COD, which was cash on delivery. You'd pay when the package arrived. So as we close out on big business and labor, a couple things to think about. Today we look at how things have kind of played out, where we've got the wealthy people in the country like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, Ted Turner, Oprah Winfrey, some of the others that are multi-billionaires. And back then we had Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan. Today there's a big gap between the rich and the poor. One thing to, I guess, ponder, to think about as we start closing down here is it a good thing that we have a big gap between the rich and the poor? Another question to think about, are men and women paid equally? Go back to the 1800s and factory work, and that certainly wasn't the case. And I guess finally, is minimum wage a good idea? And is $7.35, give a few cents here or there, a good idea? Should states raise the minimum wage? Should there be a federal increase on minimum wage? And if they did that, what would the effect of a raised minimum wage be on the consumer? Money, it's